On an autumn day heavy with stillness, when the streets of Israel were emptied of traffic and filled instead with the hush of prayer, the sanctity of Yom Kippur was torn open. It was the 6th of October 1973. The quiet was the kind that makes ordinary sounds feel reverent. Shoes on stone, the whisper of pages turned in prayer books, the soft breath of those who had fasted and come seeking forgiveness and renewal. Then a blast cracked that reverence. A grenade was thrown in Gaza City. American papers would call the attacker an Arab guerrilla, and a soldier and 2 policemen were wounded. The noise rolled away into alleys and courtyards, but the echo it left behind was larger than a single street or a single city. It became, in the days that followed, the first note in a chorus of sudden, coordinated violence. Across the Suez Canal, Egyptian forces began to move. From the northeast, Syrian units pushed across the frontier. In concert, they crossed borders and water barriers, as if stepping across a line drawn through memory itself, a line set down in 1967 during the Six-Day War. That one had carved away the Sinai and the Golan Heights, and left a bitter aftertaste of loss. Now, in the surprise of an attack launched on the holiest day of the Hebrew calendar, the ledger was reopened. In Jerusalem, the government moved with speed. Prime Minister Golda Meir, steady-voiced and unsparing, denounced the assault as madness. Her defense minister, Moshe Dayan, spoke more starkly still, calling for the harshest response and promising a fight taken to the limit. The words were not theatre. Mobilization orders spread out like ink through paper. But in apartment blocks and small houses, in towns and kibbutzim, many ordinary people knew nothing yet. Radios were silent by tradition. Newspapers lay folded. Families kept the fast quietly. In synagogues, the air was cool and expectant. The names began to be read. In congregation after congregation, a rabbi's voice carried down the aisles with lists of those called to report immediately. Steps creaked. Heads turned. From the back of one crowded sanctuary, a reservist stood when he heard his own name. He was still and then moving, sidling past coats and shawls. His father, weeping openly, pulled him into an embrace that tried to be an anchor and a shield at once. For a moment the two were locked together. The rabbi's voice, not much above a whisper, told the truth neither wished to hear. This young man's place for this day was no longer under the prayer blanket of the community. He was blessed and released. Doors opened. A life of ritual and repentance returned without transition to a life of uncertainty and war. And so began what would be called the Yom Kippur War, known to others as the October War, a conflict fierce enough that, for 3 weeks, the shape of the world seemed to blur. The fighting flared in a way that summoned comparisons few wanted to make. Tanks rolled, jets rose and fell. Artillery edged hillsides into charred and shifting ground. The intensity, observers said, rivaled the worst of the Second World War. Behind the front lines, larger shadows moved. The United States resupplied Israel with material. The Soviet Union backed the Arab states, laying crates of weapons on one side of the scale as Americans set them down on the other. There were murmurs, uneasy and persistent, that if gravity failed, the world might topple into a larger war. It didn't. But another kind of shockwave rippled outward, one not measured in maps or battle reports, but in the price of a commodity and the breath of an economy. Oil, which had turned turbines and warmed homes and lit the nights of a century, became a weapon. The embargo that followed did not fire bullets, but it sent a chill through houses and factories all the same. For families and businesses in distant places, across a continent, across an ocean, this was the moment when the connection between a country's pulse and the flow of crude became too obvious to ignore. Even so, the story didn't begin in October 1973. 2 years earlier, long before the sound of rockets over the canal, the phrase energy crisis had appeared with a new weight in American conversation. The New York Times had given it a place of its own in a 3-part series, the kind of story that tries to change both vocabulary and mind. The reporter, John Noble Wilford, reached for an old legend to frame a modern predicament. He wrote about Faust, a scholar from German law who craved forbidden knowledge and made a bargain with the devil to get it. Mephistopheles would provide power, and in exchange, Faust would pay with his soul. Wilford suggested that the modern industrial world had cut a similar deal. Where fields and rivers once set the pace of life, giant engines now did, and the power harnessed was astonishing, fantastic enough to lift a Saturn V and its crew away from Earth's gravity with the strength of hundreds of thousands of horses. But the same bargain that let a rocket climb skyward left something essential at risk. If your engines drink from a well you do not own, you must hope it is never capped. The numbers were not the kind that fit neatly inside a bedtime story, but they mattered, and they were simple enough to remember. In the early 1970s, petroleum provided nearly half of all the energy Americans used, and in the eastern half of the country, most of that oil came from elsewhere, more than 90% of it. That dependency meant that foreign governments didn't just influence the price of fuel. They could, in a sense, reach into the rhythm of daily life. A geologist would put it bluntly a few years later: whoever controls energy systems can guide the society that depends on them. It was a way of saying that a nation's strength could be tugged by invisible strings, and that those strings ran through pipelines and shipping lanes, through ports and straits whose names most people never said aloud, until their names appeared in headlines. When the fighting in the Middle East began, and American aid to Israel became a fact and not a speculation, those strings pulled tight. Oil, once thought of as a background good, became a lever. The phrase "oil as a weapon" entered the conversation, and it changed things, not only for diplomats but for people standing at petrol stations wondering whether there would be anything left when their turn came. The war itself cost dearly. More than 3,000 lives lost, and sums in military equipment too large to measure in the scale of households. But this new weapon, oil withheld, oil priced differently, oil tied to policy, had a reach and a stealth that surprised even those who had warned it was possible. Saudi Arabia moved first and visibly. In response to American support of Israel, it announced an immediate cut in oil shipments. 10% less would flow, with the warning that another 5% would be taken away each month unless arms stopped moving toward Israel. The numbers behind the percentages made the warning more tangible. Saudi Arabia was producing some 8.5 million barrels a day then, and it stood as the third largest supplier to the United States, about 400,000 barrels each day. Other members of the oil producers' cartel, the group known as OPEC, voiced their own versions of the threat. The effect of this was like discovering, in one sudden moment, the presence of a vulnerability that had long been concealed in plain sight. Oil wasn't simply an industrial lubricant or a fuel. It had become the open secret of American life, a necessary stream, and now someone upstream held a gate. By the 22nd of October, a ceasefire had been arranged. The gunfire diminished. The tanks settled into new positions. But the echoes across the diplomatic and economic landscape did not dim with the batteries. In the Arab world, the war changed a narrative. It was not a clean victory for either side, and yet something important had occurred. Egyptian soldiers had dealt losses to Israel and taken ground, real pieces of land reclaimed from maps that had been unfavourable for 6 years. Crossing the Suez Canal became more than a military operation. It turned into a phrase people said with pride, a shorthand for unity and resilience, like a song lyric that everyone knows the melody to. In capitals far from the banks of the canal, another story also shifted. The grand thaw between superpowers, the détente drafted and performed by President Richard Nixon and Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev, shivered. For the first time, the United States and the Soviet Union found themselves confronting each other directly in the Middle East. And though the confrontation did not bloom into war, it made the Cold War feel colder and closer again. It sharpened appetites in Washington and Moscow to match, then surpass each other's capabilities, to see every calculation in terms of parity and advantage. In the White House and in Congress, people whose job it was to convert anxiety into policy looked hard at the new arithmetic. America could keep pace in missiles and aircraft. It could design systems and doctrines to blunt the rivals' advances. But oil blackmail, this was the phrase that slid into conversations, pointed at something else entirely, something less halting and more continuous. Vulnerability to a consumable that the country did not possess in enough abundance. In November, barely a month after the war's opening salvo, President Nixon set his pen to an authorization that tried to address the problem at the source, as if a new well could refill an old cistern. The Alaska pipeline would be built, he declared, and the United States would spend billions of dollars to bring oil from its remote northern reserves down to where it could be refined and used. Soon, roads themselves would become instruments of conservation. The national speed limit would drop to 55 miles per hour, a signal as well as a rule, a public recognition that the days of endless fuel might be ending. The measures came quickly, but their effects could not. A reporter at the time described the embargo as the largest, most painful single problem the United States had faced in peace. Others warned that what was at stake was not merely hassle or discomfort, but the nation's political and strategic independence. If the flow of oil could be stopped or turned down, the country's power to act might be choked at the same time. The embargo was both a reminder and a prophecy. By March 1974, the numbers told a story that few people liked to read. OPEC had cut exports by 15%, which meant in American terms 1.5 million barrels a day less than before, and prices had climbed steeply. On the 17th of March, the embargo ended in a formal sense, but the consequences did not. One observer said that the oil weapon was more like a shotgun than a rifle, spreading its damage over a wide area rather than punching a single neat hole. He meant in part that price tags became heavy. Inflation rose. Growth slowed. Fuel remained expensive. It was the kind of change people notice both on their commute and in their kitchen, a change that makes each errand vaguely anxious and each plan more tentative. Predictions appeared that the world the United States had known before the embargo would not return, at least not in the same shape. And if it did not return, the reason was not simply the embargo itself. The trouble went deeper than a single political decision to enforce solidarity through scarcity. Ending the embargo didn't end the country's reliance on other people's wells and other people's policies. A congressman from California, Thomas Reese, put the point with a bleak kind of wit. The right to buy oil from the Arab world, he said, was the right to go bankrupt. The danger wasn't the absence of oil, but its cost. The numbers again were plain and brutal. In a year, the price of a barrel had jumped more than fourfold. The price at the pump had leapt too, from 38.5 cents per gallon in spring 1973 to more than 55 cents by the summer of 1974. The immediate answer was not glamorous. It was conservation. Some in the industry believed the nation could make do without Arab imports if Americans simply used less and used it more wisely. Voices rose for conservation measures that were strong rather than symbolic, and for investment in methods and machines that could stretch a gallon farther, or replace some of those gallons altogether. The logic was straightforward. If oil could be used as a weapon in political and economic conflicts, one way to dull its edge was to stop offering such a large target. Yet for all the urgency in reports and speeches, the government moved slowly. Nearly 2 years would pass before the response began to look like a plan rather than a collection of gestures. On a winter day in 1975, a group of scientists tried to shake the country awake. They were not cranks or the kind of dreamers who pass pamphlets at train stations. Among them were 11 Nobel laureates. On the 29th of January, they published a warning heavy with considered words. The United States faced a situation as serious as any since the Second World War. The danger, they said, was the energy crisis. Through lethargy and misunderstanding, the country was courting disaster. The physicist Hans Bethe, a man who had helped explain how stars shine, drafted the report. He and his colleagues wrote that without solutions, the way of life people took for granted might not endure. Editors and columnists joined the chorus. The government, some wrote, was fiddling even as the energy burned away. President Gerald Ford did not ignore those voices. He put forward a program: taxes on imported oil, research money, incentives. One line in his budget was a $1 per barrel excise on foreign crude, a prod to move Congress toward action. He thought of it, he admitted, as a kind of pressure. Putting a gun to Capitol Hill's head was his metaphor, to force the writing of a broader, better plan. By the last day of January, a Times reporter suggested the country might now be hastened into real action. On that same day, largely out of sight, 2 senior senators signed their names beneath a letter and sent it to an office that had once commanded the nation's wonder. Frank Moss of Utah, a Democrat, and Barry Goldwater of Arizona, a Republican, addressed the NASA administrator, James C. Fletcher. If the nation could put footprints on the moon, they reasoned, perhaps it could also marshal technical ingenuity to conserve the fuel that powered everyday life. That letter, quiet and bureaucratic as it may have looked, became the first page of a new chapter, one of the largest coordinated environmental efforts the country would attempt. Somewhere in the slow weave of this story, as rockets and runways begin to cross paths with gas lines and grocery budgets, it's a good moment to say, gently and without hurry, if you want more calm journeys through histories of space and the ways it touches life on Earth, consider subscribing to and liking Space Historian. It helps keep the stories coming, softly and steadily, for nights just like this. NASA turned its gaze, for a time, from the distant stars to the air and earth beneath. The pivot had, in truth, begun already. In December 1972, the final 2 astronauts of Apollo stooped and pushed away from the moon's surface, climbed their ladder, and came home. That mission, Apollo 17, closed a door that had been opened by a promise. President Kennedy's words, spoken years earlier, had sent people into that bright risk. The return of the last crew did not end exploration, but it did end a certain kind of dream, the one with dust plumes and silent horizons, and Earth rising like a painted coin above the rim of a grey world. In the years that followed, NASA's missions would arc only as high as low Earth orbit. The space shuttle would become the symbol of that new era, its thermal tiles and delta wings replacing the Saturn's thunder in the public imagination. There was something else that needed attention now. Aeronautics, the oldest word in the agency's name. Airplanes and airflow, lift and drag, engines and airframes. These had been overshadowed by the theatre of space. A Senate committee would later write with concern that the country's research base in aeronautics had eroded, not catastrophically, but noticeably, like a shoreline worn by a persistent tide. In the meantime, the cost of fuel had begun to squeeze the commercial airlines in ways that were far from abstract. Before 1972, Fuel had accounted for roughly a quarter of an airline's operating costs, a burden, but a manageable one. After the crisis, dependency grew and prices climbed, and fuel began to take up twice that share, swelling into a cost that forced route reductions, mothballed planes, and layoffs that turned paychecks into memories. The familiar sound of jets passing overhead began to carry, for the people who ran them, a new edge of worry. If there was an American institution well positioned to consider how to fly farther with less, to carve efficiency out of airflow and alloy, it was NASA. The letter from Senators Moss and Goldwater asked the agency to do just that. They wanted a plan rooted in technology but aimed squarely at practice. Innovations that industry could adopt, machines that carriers could buy, methods that mechanics could use. The purpose was not to build a museum piece or a prototype with elegant graphs and no customers. It was to preserve the nation's leadership in the skies by designing a new generation of more frugal aircraft, ones that would not sacrifice safety or environmental responsibility, ones that would not cost more or perform less, and ones that could enter service in the 1980s rather than vanish into the horizon of research. They wanted a goal that was not timid. They wanted NASA to accept risk. Inside the agency, this did not feel like a bolt from the blue. Work had already begun, quietly, carefully, on aerodynamics and structure. Engineers at Langley had been studying what they called a supercritical wing since the mid-1960s. Under the leadership of Richard Whitcomb, they reshaped the wing so that the shockwave that usually forms at high speeds would be delayed. If the wave could be postponed, drag could be reduced. If drag could be reduced, the aircraft could cruise more efficiently. One change in geometry could equate to unexpected miles of range. The line of inquiry led to more actions. In the early 1970s, NASA set up the Advanced Transport Technology Office to explore the path from concept to sky, to convert the promise of such aerodynamic chances into actual savings for carriers. Other strands of work fed into the loom as well. An active controls program proposed that computers, which were becoming lighter and more capable, could nudge control surfaces in real time to keep an airplane steadier and sleeker in flight, trimming little pockets of drag the way a sailor continuously tends a sheet to stay on the wind. And materials scientists, who had for decades treated aluminum as a kind of old friend, began to look toward newer substances. Composites, polymers reinforced in ways that gave them heft in strength without nearly the same heft in mass, offered a different future for wings and fuselages, tails and control surfaces. Tests and prototypes suggested that this lightness would not be paid for with fragility. Composite materials were also studied because of the light weight and strength of polymers compared with existing aluminum and metal airplane components. In the months after the shock of the 1973 oil embargo, a certain hush settled over boardrooms and laboratories in the United States. It wasn't the silence of inaction so much as the quiet you hear when many minds are turned towards the same problem. Fuel had become a lever that others could pull, and the country felt the tug. Within NASA, a place famed for thunder, Saturn rockets, launch countdowns, the applause that follows splashdown, engineers and managers turned down the volume and leaned into a different kind of work. How to fly farther on less. How to keep the great web of air travel aloft when kerosene became dear. Even before the embargo, the agency had begun to look hard at energy. In April 1973, it stood up a program with a name that sounded less like a ribbon cutting and more like an assignment. Energy Trends and Alternative Fuels, or ETF. Its purpose was simple to describe and difficult to achieve. Could aircraft and the systems around them use petroleum more sparingly? Could they, in certain regimes, be coaxed to sip rather than swallow? And if the answer was yes, Could the nation begin to imagine fuels beyond the familiar? Hydrogen for special cases, electricity for others? A manager wrote near the end of that year that the relevance and urgency of this work had grown dramatically since spring. Outside the windows, queues at petrol stations told the same story in a more immediate language. NASA also began to link arms with companies that built the parts the public rarely sees and the names the public often knows. With Hamilton Standard, the agency launched an effort whose title was as plain as a command: reducing the energy consumption of commercial air transportation. RECAT. Over the next 2 years, NASA would sit at tables and drawing boards with General Electric, Pratt & Whitney, Hamilton Standard itself, and American Airlines. The question was never abstract. What precisely could be changed, tuned, trimmed, redesigned to make an airplane that burned less fuel while still doing the work an airline needed it to do? By January 1975, the issue had ripened from a technical problem into a national worry, and 2 senators, Frank Moss of Utah and Barry Goldwater of Arizona, decided that the agency that could guide men to the moon could also guide the nation toward thrift in the sky. They challenged NASA to respond to the crisis that was threatening American aviation. It was not a rhetorical challenge. It came on letterhead, addressed to the administrator, James C. Fletcher, and it asked for a plan. Fletcher handed the responsibility to Alan M. Lovelace, NASA's Associate Administrator for Aeronautics and Space Technology. The title may have been long, but the task was longer still: conserve. Lovelace moved fast. Within a month, he created the Aircraft Fuel Conservation Technology Task Force, a 15-member group led by James J. Kramer of the Office of Aeronautics and Space Technology. People quickly began calling it the Kramer Committee, and its work had the focused pace of engineers with a deadline and a purpose. The committee did not sit alone in a room and guess. It listened. Members went to manufacturers and airlines and asked where the real problems lay, where energy was squandered by habit or necessity, where small changes might become large savings. They visited NASA centers as well, comparing notes and taking soundings. The information came back like samples in labeled jars. Kramer's team distilled it into briefings and slid those across tables to industry and back to the centers. In April, NASA created an advisory board to review what the task force produced, chaired by the aeronautical scientist Raymond L. Bisplinghoff of the University of Missouri. It was a wide circle. Universities like MIT, airlines such as American and Pan Am, airframe makers, including Douglas and Boeing, engine builders like Pratt & Whitney and General Electric, government agencies from NASA to the FAA, the Department of Transportation, and the Department of Defense. Out of that varied group came a name for the conservation effort itself: aircraft energy efficiency. People spoke it as a word: ACE. In May and June of 1975, the advisory board took the Kramer Committee's initial long list of possibilities and did the careful, necessary work of pruning. It's one thing to say do everything, another to decide what everything might cost, how long it would take, and which pieces could actually change the fuel bill for an airline. Some technologies were nearer to the runway. Others would take a decade of wind tunnel tests, structural coupons, flight trials, and certification work to be ready. The group kept that horizon in mind. The target they set was ambitious: by 1985 to have technology ready that could reduce fuel consumption in new civil transports by half. 2 rules were not negotiable. First, gains in fuel efficiency could not come at the expense of the environment. Second, they could not nibble at safety. The airplane would remain what it already was: a machine that guarded life. The committee's recommendations fell into a tidy, truthful framework: the old Breguet range equation that pilots learn early and no one forgets. To go farther on the same fuel, you can do three things: reduce the engine's appetite, reduce the airplane's drag, and reduce the airplane's weight. ACE answered each part of that equation with a program. Engines first. The Engine Component Improvement Project aimed not at a new miracle, but at many small refinements for existing power plants. Seals, blades, combustor liners, control schedules, dozens of parts and processes that, when improved, could add up to real thrift. The cost was estimated at $40 million. The gain, when all those small pieces were added together, might be on the order of 5% in fuel savings. 5% is not a headline, but 5% multiplied by fleets and years is a second budget for an airline. Beyond incremental change lay a larger leap: the energy-efficient engine, quickly shortened to E3. Here the goal was a new design ready to power airliners built around 1990. The work would run for 7 years and cost roughly $175 million, with a 10% fuel saving as the prize. 10% on a new, widely adopted engine is the sort of number that moves charts and keeps routes open. E3 asked difficult questions about pressure ratios, turbine inlet temperatures, materials, cooling, and controls, about how to build an engine that would be not just thrifty, but durable and certifiable on the schedules that airlines require. The third propulsion proposal was the most radical precisely because it reached backward even as it pointed forward. In an age where the public had grown used to the smooth whine of turbofans, the committee proposed returning to propellers, turboprops, driven by gas turbines. To many travellers, the very word felt like a step into the past, into cabins where propellers folded the air outside the window into blurred discs. But the reasoning wasn't nostalgic. Properly designed, with blades shaped and geared to slice the air in new ways, such propulsors could deliver savings that dwarfed the other categories, somewhere between 15 and 30% compared with existing jets. The risk was higher and the time longer. A 9-year program, $125 million, and many engineering hurdles to clear. The potential reward made it impossible to ignore. From engines, the committee turned its attention to the air outside, the flow that lifts a wing and tugs at it at the same time. The energy-efficient transport program promised evolutionary improvements that would make the airframe itself kinder to fuel. Better wing shapes, fairings and fillets, seals and gaps tended to carefully, all of it vetted by instrumented models in wind tunnels until drag slipped lower. It was a 7-year program, an estimated $50 million, with savings between 10 and 15%. Only a few people wake in the night thinking about boundary layers and interference drag, but many wake in the night because costs have risen. Here was an answer rooted in precise curves and patient testing. Even more dramatic was the idea of laminar-flow control. Almost all airliners cruise with a layer of turbulent flow along much of their wings and tails. That rumpled, energetic motion adds drag. If the flow could be held in laminar, glassy smoothness across a larger portion of the surface, the airplane would slide through the air more easily. It was a beautiful concept that had defeated many attempts. ACEE proposed a sustained 10-year, $100 million push to make it practical, with the goal of being ready to fly it in service by 1990. The reward for success was large: 20 to 40% savings in fuel, not as a standalone miracle, but as a major contributor to the total promise. It would require clever airfoils, meticulous surface finish, perhaps even systems that gently drew a whisper of air through tiny holes to keep the flow orderly. It would also require proving that rain, bugs, exhaust soot, and the ordinary scars of service would not ruin the effect. The third leg of Breguet's tripod, weight, received a program of its own. The composite primary aircraft structures effort asked the industry to imagine major parts of an airplane built not from familiar aluminum sheets and frames, but from layers of fibers in tough matrices. Boron or graphite filaments embedded in polyamide, epoxy, or even aluminum. If properly designed and manufactured, such structures could rival or surpass metals in strength and stiffness while weighing much less. Lose a pound, save fuel forever. The plan called for 8 years of work, roughly $180 million, and a target of 10 to 15% fuel savings through weight reduction. The milestone for service entry sat at 1985, close enough to matter, far enough to demand steady development rather than a rush. Not everyone agreed that the agency should tilt so much of its aeronautical budget towards civil fuel conservation. In June 1975, Hans Mark, then the director of NASA's Ames Research Center, wrote to Lovelace to say as much. He acknowledged that fuel conservation was clearly in the national interest, but he cautioned against letting it swallow other aeronautical needs. Priorities shift, he reminded his colleagues. In 1968, the crisis was airport congestion. In 1970, it was airport noise. By 1974, it was fuel. The pendulum swings, and an agency must be careful not to chase it so hard that it forgets the center. Mark also suggested that meaningful savings might be found not just in airframes and engines, but in the way airlines fly. More efficient trajectories, procedures, and traffic management. His letter was not a veto. It was a call to keep perspective. Lovelace heard the caution and moved ahead anyway. The plan that Kramer's group assembled held together as a coherent whole, and the stakes were high. The 6 recommendations carried a projected total cost of $670 million over a decade. The savings from each could not simply be added like apples. Different technologies applied to different classes of airplanes at different times. But in combination, the package aimed at the stated goal: a halving of fuel consumption for new transports within the rules of safety and environmental responsibility. Bisplinghoff, as chair of the advisory board, delivered the conclusions and the outline to Lovelace on the 30th of July, 1975. There was one more question to settle, and it wasn't technical. What precisely was NASA's role? The committee's members came from places where the word mission meant different things. Industry builds and sells, universities teach and explore, government sets goals and knits together the efforts that private risk cannot justify. ACEE, the group admitted, went further in demonstrating civil technologies than NASA typically had done. But the consensus, tested in long discussions, was that this was necessary. Some of the most promising lines of work, advanced turboprops and laminar-flow control for instance, had high technical risk. Airlines and manufacturers had incentives to be cautious with capital. Without federal leadership and money to de-risk the hardest parts, these ideas might never leave the laboratory. In September 1975, the committee published its final report, Aircraft Fuel Conservation Technology. At the same time, a separate analysis unfolded with a different set of tools. NASA hired Ultra Systems, a California firm skilled in building economic models, to ask the question that budgets always ask: what do we get back for what we put in? Using a 10-year window, they started with the committee's total cost, $670 million, and compared it with the fuel the airline fleet was likely to consume. The industry was in flux. Ultra Systems cautioned. Forecasts were by nature imperfect. To steady the picture, they leaned on proprietary data that manufacturers had provided to NASA's Ames Research Center and on information from the airlines themselves. Then they ran the numbers. If the 6 ACE programs were implemented, the savings could be the equivalent of 677,500 barrels of oil each day. The rate of return depended on the future price of a barrel, a variable no model can lock down, but the range they predicted was both wide and attractive. For every dollar invested in ACEE, somewhere between $7.50 and $26 might come back to the economy. Finally, Ultra Systems asked where the money should come from. Their answer was unambiguous. The capital required was so large and the time horizon so long that private industry alone was extremely unlikely to shoulder it. Federal support, they concluded, was necessary. With the technical plan drawn and the economic case made, the matter moved to a different kind of room. Hearing rooms on Capitol Hill. In the autumn of 1975, the Senate Committee on Aeronautical and Space Sciences opened its doors to testimony. Executives from airlines and manufacturers, administrators from NASA, officers from the military, and representatives of professional societies all came to speak. The question was straightforward. Should the United States fund one of the largest, most coordinated fuel conservation programs it had ever attempted for its civil aviation sector? The answers would arrive not as a single voice, but as a chorus. On the 10th of September, one of the first to testify was Clifton F. Von Kahn, a senior vice president of the Air Transport Association of America, the umbrella group for almost all of the nation's carriers. His message unfurled in calm sentences. Aviation, he said, was more than a way to get from one city to another. It was one of the pillars of American power, part of military strength, and a vital column of the domestic economy. Fuel for airlines was lifeblood. Threaten that flow, and you threatened the health of the system that tied the country together. The energy crisis, left to run its course without countermeasures, posed a serious danger to the airlines and, by extension, to the nation. Von Kahn endorsed the NASA plan the Kramer Committee had shaped. It promised not just fuel saved, but economics improved. Approval, he said, was warranted. The military's perspective aligned with that view. Walter B. LaBerge, the Assistant Secretary of the Air Force for Research and Development, reminded the senators that the Air Force consumed roughly half of all the fuel allocated to the Department of Defense. Its representatives had worked with NASA on the Kramer Committee, and they saw in ACEE a direct benefit to the nation's security and to the service's ability to fly the missions they were given. The Air Force was enthusiastic, he said. NASA's own leaders spoke as well. George M. Lowe, the agency's deputy administrator, chose a fact that was plain and bracing. In the Western world, nearly 4 out of every 5 airplanes had been manufactured in the United States, and that leadership didn't simply burnish pride, it brought dollars, billions of them, in exports. If the United States failed to push forward in fuel efficiency, the export market could wither, and with it, jobs and prestige. Our world leadership in aviation, Lowe warned, is in serious danger today. Alan Lovelace added a different prod, competition from the East. Soviet designers, he noted, had already developed a high-efficiency turboprop that could cruise at speeds close to contemporary jets. If the United States wished to keep pace, it must commit the resources to do so. Bisplinghoff, who had chaired the advisory board, put it with the engineer's economy. Money invested in developing conservation technologies for aircraft was, in his view, a better investment than the continued import of Middle Eastern oil. A second day of testimony came on the 23rd of October. George H. Pedersen, technical coordinator for the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics, presented the conclusions of the organization's technical hierarchy. The language was unambiguous. They strongly endorsed, and he said universally approved, the Kramer Committee's proposals. Industry alone, in their view, could not launch a program of such magnitude and see it through. Airlines carried passengers. They did not carry the sort of capital risk these long-term projects required. Only NASA could knit the threads together. The only criticism they offered was a gentle one. Alternative fuels were not a prominent part of the conservation plan, and perhaps they should be. Carl G. Haar Jr., president of the Aerospace Industries Association, added another supportive voice. Yes, NASA should lead, he said, but industry must be present not just at the beginning, but at the end, during certification and production. That is where technology transfer becomes more than a buzzword, where a concept becomes a flying, earning asset. The program, as the Kramer Committee envisioned it, was a joint venture in the truest sense. Government nurturing technologies to the point where companies could accept them without gambling their existence, and companies then carrying those technologies into the market quickly and safely. From the companies themselves came a trio of nods. A Boeing vice president told the senators that NASA's research program should, over time, yield major fuel savings for the United States and help preserve American technological leadership. A vice president from Pratt & Whitney, looking at the problem through the lens of an engine maker, said he had no doubt that implementing NASA's plan could play a significant role in reaching national conservation goals for air transport. And a vice president from General Electric put the matter in a phrase that sounded less like an aspiration and more like a destination. The program, he said, would help the United States reach energy independence. On the committee's final day of testimony, the 4th of November 1975, the room felt poised between caution and hope. An international voice opened the proceedings. Yuji Sawa, a vice president of All Nippon Airways, Japan's largest carrier and by then the 7th biggest airline on Earth. He did not speak in abstractions. 4/5 of Japan's fuel, he explained, came from the Middle East. When the embargo followed the October 1973 crisis, it squeezed Japan's economy and pushed the nation into urgent conservation. If the United States could bring forth a new generation of fuel-efficient aircraft, Sawa said, Japan would be ready to buy them, to exchange older fleets for leaner ones as quickly as airlines could take deliveries. The promise of demand was not a whisper. It was a clear, practical offer from a nation that felt energy's bite every day. After Sawa, the microphone passed to Charles F. McCurleen, the president of United Airlines. He too spoke from the front line rather than the laboratory. United employed roughly 49,000 people and burned about 1.5 billion gallons of fuel each year. If energy trends continued as they were, he warned, they would not merely bruise his company, they would place its future in jeopardy. It was not only a serious problem, it had the potential to be crippling. He endorsed NASA's conservation plan as one of the necessary measures to guide airlines out of a fuel trap and towards solvency. But a hearing that gathers many perspectives will inevitably hold reservations as well as endorsements. The technical foundations of NASA's fuel-saving program were strong, and industry support was unusually broad. Yet technologies do not float above the world. They land in an economy, and the economy can tilt the ground beneath their feet. Representatives from the Federal Energy Administration and the Energy Research and Development Administration, ERDA, arrived with concerns shaped by balance sheets as much as by wind tunnel curves. Roger W. Sant, an assistant administrator at the Federal Energy Administration, raised the first red flag. In his view, the Kramer Committee's report had not wrestled adequately with external variables, the forces that ultimately decide whether an airline will sign a contract. Even if the research succeeded, what would conditions look like a decade on? Would the market be ready to pay for more efficient aircraft? Would the capital costs of building and buying such machines be justified by the fuel they saved? Sant said NASA had not been asked to run those numbers, and he was not sure that, even with success in the test cell and the tunnel, The research represented the best use of limited federal energy funds. Without a clear picture of adoption and return, he implied, even elegant technology could become expensive potential rather than realized value. ERDA's Deputy Administrator, James S. Kane, followed with a broader budgetary caution. He acknowledged that NASA had correctly identified promising avenues for airline fuel savings. But, he said, the scope felt too large given the competing claims on energy research. In short, NASA was asking for a disproportionate share. Kane pointed to the pie chart of national petroleum consumption. More than half was burned by private automobiles. Trucks and buses took another fifth. Airlines, while drawing some 11 billion gallons per year, accounted for roughly 7 to 10% of the total. With finite resources for research and development, he argued, the first priority should be the automobile, where even small percentage gains could translate into enormous absolute savings. A third assessment, this one from Econ Inc., a Princeton-based consultancy, landed somewhere between the enthusiasm of industry and the reservations of the energy agencies. Their economists spent 3 months modeling the likely effects of NASA's 6 programs. On paper, the savings were compelling. Roughly 90.3 billion gallons of fuel, or about 2.15 billion barrels, conserved between 1976 and 2005. But their forecasts hinged on a crucial hinge: adoption. How quickly would airlines retire older jets? How would the price and availability of fuel, as well as expected returns on capital, shape purchase decisions? Econ observed that if fuel made up 20 to 35% of an airline's operating costs, the aircraft that maximized profit might not be the aircraft that minimized fuel burn. That is, the best price point for an airline's fleet plan might not align with the absolute minimum fuel consumption an airframe or engine could offer. To bridge that gap, they recommended the government consider incentives, ways to nudge carriers toward the new technologies once NASA and industry had proved them. Otherwise, they warned, clever engineering could sit idle, waiting on economics to catch up. With those final statements, the autumn hearings drew to a close. NASA had produced a draft blueprint for 6 interlocking conservation efforts. The engineers had run their sums. The economists had run theirs. Participants sensed that the Senate audience had been friendly, attentive to the stakes, and open to the argument that fuel efficiency was no longer a luxury but a lifeline. Yet the central question still stood quietly in the aisle as the room emptied. Would the government approve the plan? If you're enjoying this gentle journey through the hinge moments where space-age thinking meets life on Earth, and you'd like more stories told in this calm, end-of-day way, consider subscribing to and liking Space Historian. It helps keep the lights soft, the pace unhurried, and the episodes coming. 3 months later, the answer arrived. On the 17th of February 1976, the Senate Committee on Aeronautical and Space Sciences released its report on the Aircraft Fuel Efficiency Program. The committee was led by the same pair who, a year earlier, had set the whole process in motion with a letter. Frank Moss of Utah and Barry Goldwater of Arizona. NASA's 6-part response, backed by a chorus of voices from across industry, formed, in the committee's judgment, a persuasive case for funding the full $670 million effort. Their published conclusions read less like a reckoning and more like a roadmap. First, they had learned that fuel efficiency would be decisive in the contest for the world's aircraft market. In a future of dearer oil and tighter margins, the airframe that went farther on the same gallon, and did so reliably, would win orders. Second, a national push on efficiency would act as a stimulus for the wider aeronautical sector. Benefits would not be confined to the marquee names on the fuselage. They would ripple through the supply chain. fabricators, systems suppliers, materials companies, avionics houses. In 1974, more than 500,000 Americans worked in the aircraft and parts industry. A program of this scale would touch many of them. Third, they argued, a new generation of thrifty aircraft would offer much-needed assistance to the air transportation system itself, which had been struggling to remain profitable amid volatile oil prices. The gains would not be immediate, research rarely is, but Moss and Goldwater doubted that the pressure of higher fuel costs would evaporate. In the foreseeable future, they wrote, that pressure would remain urgent and more efficient aircraft would be both desirable and beneficial in the decades ahead. Fourth, the committee underscored that this was, at its heart, an energy conservation project. If the package of technologies could reduce fuel consumption for new airliners by up to half, the benefits would not end at the ledger. Environmental gains, lower emissions, quieter operations would accompany the savings, and as fuel use fell, so would demand for oil. When demand softens, price does too, a basic economic truth that could translate into steadier costs and improve profitability for carriers. Finally, the report touched the quiet chord that had thrummed beneath the entire year's discussion: national strength. The program, they wrote, would reduce the country's vulnerability to the whims of oil-rich nations. It would also have military echoes. Technologies that improved range and efficiency in civil transports could, adapted and proven, carry bombers and patrol aircraft farther for the same fuel. There was, as well, the question of who should take the risk. The committee's answer was unequivocal. The federal government should bear the costs and uncertainties of this research and development. The reasons were practical. Developing a new aeroplane already cost on the order of $1 billion. In that financial climate, it was no mystery why manufacturers tended to be conservative in their technological choices. A single misstep could ripple across payrolls and order books, and even if a company undertook the work alone, the fruits would remain proprietary, narrowing the national benefit to a handful of shareholders. The fuel efficiency effort, Moss and Goldwater wrote, was a classic case for public investment. NASA, they added, was the right agency to lead. The public might associate it with lunar dust and shuttle tiles, but aeronautics had always lived in its name. The agency did not build and sell airliners. It matured ideas and transferred them at the right moment. In this, the committee saw its value precisely: to advance the technology to the point where industry could adopt it with confidence and then to hand it over. The report did not ignore the criticisms raised during the hearings. To the charge that no one could say exactly how much fuel would be saved, the senators replied that this was precisely why research was warranted, to find out which ideas worked at scale. To the worry that airlines might lack the capital to buy efficient aircraft by 1985, they pointed to the aging of the fleet. Airliners would need replacing with something. Why would executives choose to purchase older, thirstier designs? To the broader complaint that automobiles consumed far more fuel than aircraft, and thus deserved a larger share of research funds, they answered in narrower terms. No automotive conservation program was on their docket. The aircraft fuel efficiency plan should be judged on its own merits, not as a casualty of a never-proposed alternative. As for the unknowable tally of total industry costs once the research succeeded, they conceded that one could not fix every figure in advance. There was no indication, they said, that costs would be prohibitive. Broad industry support suggested the opposite, insisting that every cost and benefit be assessed before a decision would risk paralysis by arithmetic, especially when basic research was involved. They were, in any case, convinced of the asymmetry. The potential benefits would far exceed the costs. In the end, their conclusion was firm and plain. On fuel savings alone, the aircraft fuel efficiency program was attractive. Considering the full range of benefits and NASA's charge to maintain American leadership in aeronautics, it was essential. With that mandate in hand, NASA moved from plan to action, dividing the 6 initiatives between 2 of its centers, Lewis Research Center in Ohio and Langley Research Center in Virginia, where teams now face the quiet work of turning sketches, equations, and wind tunnel traces into flight-worthy hardware to make these technological dreams a reality.